Welcome to Kellogg's Global Politics, a podcast on current events in U.S. foreign policy and international affairs. My name is Dr. Anita Kellogg, an international relations scholar specializing in the relationship between economics and national security. I'm here with my co-host Ryan Kellogg, an expert in energy investment and policy.
Thanks, and glad to be back. So this is episode 46, and we're recording this on June 16th, 2024.
The past few weeks have seen several important elections in India, the EU, and Mexico. We discussed the impact in their respective regions and to the larger international environment. We also discussed the latest in the EV battery wars. Is there a path forward for the U.S. to decrease dependence on China? And does it come at the cost of meeting U.S. environmental climate goals? So, happy Father's Day to Ryan.
Thank you very much.
We thought it would be a good day to feature the article you wrote in the Pittsburgh Gazette on why Trump's energy plans are not actually good for energy industry.
Yeah, so we actually meant to mention this in the last episode, but I had an opportunity to write an op-ed piece together with my colleague, David Burnett, that I worked together with at Black Knight Energy for. And yeah, it was basically a looking ahead, like a lot of people are now, to the November election and the potential consequences of future Trump administration. And I know a lot of people are also highlighting this Project 2025, which of course is the Heritage Plan's foundation and kind of policy Bible for a potential Trump administration. And one big aspect of that is energy policy. And, naturally you would think, coming from the oil and gas industry, one of the things that Trump emphasizes is on day one of his dictatorship, just one day dictatorship, so we don't have to be worried. He's going to implement, among other things, is drill, baby, drill,
right,
which I interpret as just any federal leases that are out there now open for oil and drilling, regardless of whether it's economic or attractive, from an investment standpoint. And that's all fine and well. So you would think oil and gas industry would be completely on board with that. But what we emphasize in this article is that the industry's moved beyond the 2000s, the early 2000s, which essentially this policy is frozen at. And it's embraced a lot of the policies of both the energy transition and the narrative and actions around climate change. I mean, you had the COP meeting last November, which was heavily attended by the oil and gas industry. And it made these huge commitments around reductions in methane and other greenhouse gas emissions. So the fact that the Heritage Plan, this Project 2025, seeks to roll back a lot of that, seeks to roll back the emissions, seeks to roll back all the subsidies from the Inflation Reduction Act, particularly around carbon capture and sequestration. So both of these aspects, the industry has already invested billions of dollars in. They're very excited about, the potential opportunities, particularly on the carbon sequestration side, because it's a natural fit for the industry's skill set. It requires geological analysis, requires drilling and injection, requires the huge transport of massive volumes of gas and then storage underground. These are all things that only the oil and gas industry really has the experience in. So to strip away all these future business opportunities just doesn't make a lot of sense. And I think it's something we'll get into in this episode, also around battery manufacturing. It's something that a lot of the provisions of the IRA are benefiting directly Republican-led districts. So there seems to be a disconnect between the provisions that are in like Project 2025, which a lot of these policies are old bugaboos that Republicans have had since at least the 1990s, versus where industry, particularly the energy industry, is right now. So that's really what this article emphasizes. And we chose the Pittsburgh Gazette just because, there's only so many energy capitals kind of in the country. Houston's one of them, but Pittsburgh is a big source of, the center of the Appalachian Marcellus shale and natural gas industry. So it made sense to get it kind of in front of that audience. And obviously, Pennsylvania voters are going to be critical in this coming election. So it's a little bit of a unexpected, I think, opinion, having oil and gas professionals say, hey, wait a second, a lot of this benefits our industry. Let's take a second look at this.
Right, exactly. So it's very interesting. And I'll put a link in the show notes, and so you can check it out yourself.
Yep.
Well, so on to the main part of the show, and want to begin with the election in India, where, as expected, Modi secured a third successive term as India's prime minister on June 10th. But to many's surprise, he emerged from the election in a much weaker position. So his party, the BJP, failed to secure an outright majority and now must form a coalition to stay in power. So they aimed to take a supermajority, which was 370 seats in the 543 lower house, but ended up winning only 240. Now, this was a surprise to many in the international community because so many of the opposition had been prosecuted directly, and there had been many sort of authoritarian measures with the judiciary and a lot of elements that did not favor the opposition at all. So many expected that he might get the supermajority. So along these lines, he also lost a majority of seats in India's most populous state. And, they lost despite delivering a lot of red meat to his Hindu nationalist base in the state, including a newly consecrated temple to the Hindu deity Ram and virulent anti-Muslim rhetoric. So one of the reasons for this is that it was driven over anger in the economy, like many of the other elections. So one thing that's interesting from this is that there are a lot of direct welfare payments to the poor that have been expanded under Modi, but the complaint was more because the economic growth has been very unequally distributed. And so you've seen still remaining high unemployment, stagnant wages, flat consumption, and widening inequality. So the lower part of society has not been able to share in any of the economic gains. Therefore, any new policy would have to address these fundamental causes and cannot rely simply on cash transfers. One of the things that has been noted is that it seems to point to a resilience of Indian democracy when faced with increasing authoritarian tactics under Modi. One thing also that I thought was really interesting was the role of the caste system in the election. And I was listening to a report on CNN from Christine Amanpour, just talking about how important in this election was the lower caste splitting away from BJP and voting for opposition parties. And in some sense, this is because Modi has tried to eliminate affirmative action, and under his unified Hindu party, there isn't room to discuss fair distribution based on the caste system. So one of the concerns of the Kumar's United Party that they are arguing for that there should be a census of the different castes just to have the information about how many belong to each caste. And that would help focus on having more fair distribution based on caste. Now, the reason why the BJP opposes this is that fractures the idea of a single Hindu coalition, which they want to maintain. So what are your thoughts on the election?
I mean, it came as a big surprise because certainly everything, when we were in India last year in 2023, everything leading up to it was expectation that Modi would be coronated and kind of ushering in this period of just the complete domination by BJP. They would point to, on the international stage, India is hosting like the G20. They have this much greater role within the global South that he's been pushing forward. And then on the growth side, I mean, India does have the number one growing economy with the struggles that China has been in over the last 5 years or so. And there were, even what we witnessed, not so much in Rajasthan, one of the poorest states where we spent most of our time, but there's definitely the evidence of infrastructure investments, of wide-scale electricity throughout, even the more rural areas. So there are successes they could point to, but obviously particularly given the effects of coronavirus pandemic and the Ukraine war and all the subsequent inflation and kind of struggles, that those gains weren't distributed equally.
Although they do get oil cheaper now.
They do get, yeah. And I think that probably helped in terms of like the energy cost, but that's kind of only one aspect of kind of where particularly the poor and the lower caste have pain. But yeah, I think a lot of it is just the job creation, and the failures of the education system, which is still struggling a lot in terms of educating the people to be competitive as, the world's workshop. Particularly in the North, where he lost a lot of voters. This is the northern part of the country is really kind of the core of his base, of where the Hindu nationalist message really resonates. And that's where he lost the most votes, despite the fact that, like you mentioned, he was throwing that red meat of tons of just very virulent, even by U.S. standards now, of anti-Muslim rhetoric. And it didn't work because, it goes back to James Carville's economy's stupid. And in this case, it was about jobs, high unemployment, and the increasing disparity between caste.
I mean, what's fascinating is you can say India is the fastest growing economy, but for most people, they're not seeing any increase in their lifestyle. It's not affecting them at all. And so what I find so interesting is when we were in Rajasthan, the area being so poor, like people did emphasize, it's brought electricity to our areas. It's brought more sanitation to our areas. But how they want something more fundamental to that when they hear about these growth rates, they want to be able to have, better incomes, better able to provide for their children, as well as better education systems. And so the lack of social mobility, the lack of just even internal improving your life is really kind of at odds with these numbers that we hear from the dynamicness of Indian economy, which appears to be only going to the benefit of a very small group of people.
Right. And despite all the other thing that we witnessed was, the increase in control of the media, of the judiciary system. Yeah. So the fact that the opposition groups were able to push back against that and to have this electoral result where you're going to have a much more constrained BJP going in that's going to have to compromise, it seems extraordinarily positive for democracy overall. I mean, this is the world's largest democracy, and it seemed to be falling into a one-party authoritarian rule. And now, it's completely changed.
Yeah, but I'm interested how this will affect, if Modi will still have the power to persecute the media and political opposition parties, since, the judicial system he's already interfered with. Does this really change things? It definitely seems like it keeps it from becoming more authoritarian because he doesn't have the supermajority to change the Constitution further. But I don't know. It's definitely a victory, but I don't know how much it rolls back already the authoritarian policies that Modi has put into place.
Yeah, but it seems like it certainly stanches the flow in that direction. It shows that, well, politically, it's not getting you there going in that direction anyway. But yeah, I think it'll be interesting. In terms of the business view in the community, I think it was initially negative, because this is seen as harder for him to implement, some of the reforms and make it a little bit easier for foreign capital to invest in the country. Though obviously with opposition, there's going to be a lot more consensus building. That's something that Modi in particular has not shown any proclivity to during his political career. So I think a lot of the analysis has been focused on, well, this guy's basically been able to do what he wants for his 25-year political career. How's he going to work with coalition partners that have different views? And can he successfully set up India, which does have this very robust growth rate and certainly has the interest of the developed world to have a counter to China. So you can still have potentially all this investment coming in, but can you do that in a way that is more sustainable instead of focused on a personality cult that he was building before?
Yeah. And ironically, while this election points to the need for more fundamental economic reform to benefit a greater amount of people. It may also be harder to make those reforms because of the need to consensus build and just the additional amount of time it takes to team up with partners, get people on board. So I think that's kind of an interesting thing to watch, is if anyone in India can really make the kind of economic reforms that India needs and would produce an even more dynamic economy.
Yeah, it definitely remains. I mean, I think the Foreign Affairs article by Pradip Mehta kind of points out that, when you can't just focus on, okay, these infrastructure projects or straight out and out welfare cash transfers, you have to look at the very fundamental institutions itself. And it becomes a lot more challenging when it's about improving the education system or agricultural reform or just all these fundamental building blocks that it'll take to have a more equitable distribution of the future economic gains within the country. And yeah, it's a huge challenge for sure.
I think this is really key for India because, even as we hear about this dynamic growth, the distribution has been so unequal. There's still so much incredible poverty in India. And I think that definitely hampers some of its success that it needs to have going forward in terms of becoming, a major power in itself.
Yeah. And it's going to have to negotiate it in a way that China didn't. Because essentially, Modi was trying to recreate, instead of with the CCP, instead the BJP essentially as this one party state rule, forced through without compromise, the reforms necessary. But obviously China coming out of the Cultural Revolution had to make, big investments in education. It was such an anti-intellectual push during that period. But they had the advantage of that one party rule. But India has to do these reforms with, extraordinarily complex and diverse democracy. So it really is kind of writ large another front on the civilizational consideration of democracy versus autocracy. And we really got to be cheering for India, because if India can work, given all of its complexities and this need for consensus building, can it recreate the success that like China has had, despite the fact that you have all these different groups and different interests competing with each other in a real democracy?
Yeah, I think the comparison to China is also interesting in the fact that so many, although as it's grown increasingly, the distributions have been unequal, but initially, it lifted so many millions out of poverty, right? And you're not seeing that same transformation in India.
Yeah, you're not seeing that. It has the potential to be, but it's starting at a point where China was in, let's say, the early 80s.
Right.
Like probably that level of economic development.
Probably something like that.
Yeah.
Maybe a little.
I was still shocked. I went over there thinking it was similar to like Malaysia, failing, maybe like $10,000 per capita GDP. And it's like Nigeria. Mm-hmm. It's like 2,000-3,000. Just very, very poor country.
Yeah. So hopefully this will lead to some positive changes and definitely makes it a better partner internationally so that we're partnering with a dynamic democracy rather than a state that's moving more towards authoritarianism.
I think it is good overall. I think either way, the foreign policy aspect in our relationship with India wouldn't have changed because our interest, where that overlap are the same. But I think it strengthens them on the world stage. Mm-hmm. Because it does show, they are a real democracy. And as a key member, as the biggest, most populous country of the global South, that's extraordinarily important.
And as India becomes a more important player, right? So I was reading in our research that by 2027, they should be the third largest economy, which makes sense given how populous they are. Then as they become more important, it's very important that we see them to be a democracy and not another potential major power that's authoritarian.
Yep.
So the EU also had some surprising elections, and I think you wanted to go over those.
Yeah, and normally, this is probably the first EU parliamentary elections that I've really paid much attention to. And I think it's not so much the outcome of those elections as much as the consequences for the national governments from these. But just to give a little background, so the EU elections were held June 6th to 9th and occurs simultaneously across all 27 member states. The EU, we've talked some about, and I know you studied it in detail at the University of Amsterdam, kind of in its early stages following expansion. But the EU Parliament has a wide range of powers in setting trade policy, regulatory authority, agriculture, and immigration. And within this last election, you had over 180 million people voted, which represented about a 50% turnout, which actually was pretty good. Because one of the criticisms, definitely, at the time that we lived in the Netherlands, was that the EU is fundamentally anti-democratic institution, that it doesn't really represent its member states. And part of the things that it pointed out was kind of the low turnout. So seeing a 50% turnout is actually fairly decent. Now, the major outcomes from this and that got all the headlines were around Germany and French delegations to the EU Parliament. And what was key here was that the national parties of the heads of these governments, so on the German side, Scholz's Social Democratic Party and his coalition partners on the left, saw very heavy losses in terms of their seats to the EU Parliament. But on the bigger side was French President Emmanuel Macron's Central Alliance captured less than 15% of the vote compared to his competitor in the last election, Le Pen's far-right National Party, the National Rally, which captured margins twice as much, so over 30% of the vote. So this kind of sent shockwaves, and there were concerns definitely before the election that the far-right would make big gains within the EU. But in reality, it was mostly the centrist parties held sway. So in terms of the dynamics and the direction of EU policy, which from a U.S. perspective, we can look at mostly as the Ukraine policy, which is really key, and then around regulatory authority, which more and more like U.S. tech companies have gotten caught up in the EU regulatory net, particularly around privacy. Essentially, none of that dynamic is going to change as a result of these elections. The European People's Party is going to maintain its majority, and the pro-EU parties essentially are going to still have 450 seats out of 720. That being said, the EU faces a number of different challenges over the next 5 years, and that's really why there was some nervousness around it, particularly with the Ukraine war, the need for increased coordination among the member states and joint policies. So among those challenges will be EU expansion, so both Georgia, Moldova, and of course Ukraine, and focusing on that. They have increasing demands for joint budget, particularly when looking ahead at trying to increase defense spending, increase coordination on the defense side. And then, of course, the potential return of a Trump administration and what that would mean for transatlantic relationships. But going back, the real impact was on the national government side. And what Emmanuel Macron, the French president, did really shocked everybody. So faced with this very strong rebuke of his party, he, as works within these parliamentary sort of systems, called a snap election, basically saying, hey, French people, French public, do you really want to support the far-right National Rally? I mean, it's one thing to send as a protest vote to the EU Parliament where they have limited power, like on the average French citizen. So he gambled, rolled the dice, and essentially there's going to be a big parliamentary election on June 30th. So what are your thoughts on that gamble? Do you think it's going to pay off, or do you think it was foolish for him to do that?
Well, one of the things I think he's also betting on is, can the right unify? So the left has been very organized and unifying against the far right, but they've had a harder time getting their main parties to work with each other. And so I think he's hoping that that lack of unity will help give more of an opening to the leftist parties, or left of center, really. or even the center. But will it work? I hope it works, but obviously it's a huge gamble. Certainly did not need to call elections this early. And I think a lot of people are very concerned that this will not work out for Macron.
Yeah, so the markets definitely didn't like it. The French stock market dropped 6% on this, and just concerned that you can have a much more dysfunctional government going forward. Not to mention abandonment of a lot of the tough reforms that Macron was pushing for. A lot of the reason for his unpopularity, which a lot of it is due to, again, to the effects of inflation and the struggling global economy and kind of its impact on the average person's personal finances. But the other thing he pushed through was around labor market reform. He increased the retirement age from 64 or 62 to 64. So in him rolling the dice, he's essentially hoping also that even if his party, the Renaissance Party, gets a severe drubbing in this election and ends up having actually share power, because France has kind of a weird system where it combines a presidential system and a parliamentary system. Mm-hmm. So you have both a president who I think definitely has substantially more power, particularly around like foreign policy, than the prime minister does.
Absolutely.
But nevertheless, you could have this instance where you have Macron as president and then a national rally prime minister. In this case, it would be this individual, Jordan Bardella, which led the EU parliamentary election and is seen as the protege of Marie Le Pen. I was shocked. He's only 28.
Wow.
I mean, Macron was like famous for getting elected when he was 39 as president in 2017. But this guy is 28.
Wow.
Which is pretty wild. So he could be the party's prime minister. And what Macron is hoping is that, okay, you've been this protest party, frankly, for decades now. You know, before Marie was under her father. Let's see how you do when you actually have some power and you're part of a governing coalition. And I think his bet is that whatever happens, and probably result in chaos, that when the more consequential presidential election occurs in 2027, that essentially they can blame everything on National Rally and that way kind of neuter them up front. So give them a little bit of power, be able to still constrain them, then blame all the problems on them. So that's kind of his other gamble. If the strategy doesn't work, to get people to sober up and say, we don't really want to have National Rally in charge of this country, which really historically, if this did happen, it would be the first return of the far right to power since the Vichy government, which is the one that collaborated with the Nazis from 1940 to 1944. So it'd be really unprecedented.
Yeah, I was also just looking at articles to see if anyone had some idea of who might win this. And I think people are pretty divided on whether this will lead to a far-right majority. But having a simple majority is not the same thing as having dominance within the legislature. So that will play out a lot in the things that you just said.
In terms of who your coalition partners are, and then how much of that protest vote goes instead to the left, to the far left, as opposed to a national rally.
Yeah, and I don't know how this affects the election, but in the last day or so, there's been huge protest against the far right. So I don't know, again, how that affects election results. But
yeah, I mean, it's kind of similar. They showed like a map of the election results, and obviously all the population centers.
Yeah.
And they even have the same coloration. I think we poisoned everybody's political system. So you see like the little tiny blue, but that's where Paris is.
Yeah.
So it's much easier to organize these big protests where the opposition exists, or the majority probably rather exist in Paris. I'm not surprised you can get big like urban protest as opposed to the rural countryside, which is very much pro-national rally.
Yeah, I think it reflects the frustration that you see with the left in the U.S. too, right? Is these urban centers, these educated people, and feeling frustrated that, you know, at least in the U.S., you're kind of losing out to minority in many cases, but kind of expressing some of that frustration through protests.
Well, and the French definitely have no problem.
Yeah.
They'll protest at the drop of a hat and burn down half the streets.
So I think it's concerning. I think businesses do not like this, and they don't like uncertainty in general, and they're not excited about having a far-right majority in France. Now that may hinder some of the economic reforms that Macron has tried to push through and has on his agenda.
Yeah, it's definitely, but it'll be interesting. I mean, because we're heading into it. We mentioned the UK election last time. That's happening this summer too.
Mm-hmm. I think around July.
So you're having these just major U.S. partners having very consequential elections. It does reinforce, although this Mexico example is going to go counter to my hot potato theory of politics post-coronavirus, but basically any administration that had the unfortunate experience of being in power during this period of high inflation and due both to coronavirus and to the Ukraine war is just getting drubbed. We talked a little about before the podcast on the approval ratings of like major world leaders at like the G7. And you were talking about a graphic that showed like where Biden was.
And Biden was like the most popular or the least popular of all of them. I think there was maybe one that had a slightly lower disapproval rating than Biden, but it was a funny graphic.
Yeah, because it is universal. Yeah, because Schultz, Trudeau, obviously Macron, we talked about, extraordinarily unpopular Sunak. These are all people that are going to face, well, those that are having to face elections are just going to get absolutely drubbed. And I think you can even throw Modi in there, even though Modi was much more popular.
I don't
He's still got drubbed because of inflation and the hot potato theory.
I don't think that's why he lost. I think it's more fundamental economic structures that have not changed.
I think inflation, definitely food inflation because of Ukraine and the coronavirus, that affects poor Indians a lot.
I didn't read any articles that suggested inflation was one of the causes.
Yeah, cost of living. This just is kind of implied that.
When it says cost of living is stagnant, does not say to me, oh, this is coronavirus inflation. That's causing.
But what? It's a global phenomenon. So I think even Modi was punished because of the hot potato theory. Now, mind you, the Mexico thing throws my theory out the window. But I think some of the other examples are more accurate, but I don't think that was the main reason in India. So anyway, it's all going to be a test of this, including most critically the election in November here.
I'm so depressed.
I think Biden's in trouble because of my hot potato theory.
I was nearly in tears today. It's that sad. Well, so certainly an election that goes against your hot potato theory is the Mexican election, where they rewarded the current party in power to a very dominant result. So Claudia Sheinbaum, which we're hoping is the correct pronunciation. It's very weird to see a German name in a Mexican election. But she was the protege of the current president, Andres Manuel Lopez, who was term limited. And she'll be Mexico's first woman president. So they got a supermajority in the lower house and just 3 short of a supermajority in the upper house, which could change because there is also often some grasshoppering, which is when legislatures flip parties. And now the party runs 24 out of the 32 governorships in Mexico. So this victory represents a step back to the one-party rule, similar before the 90s when the Mexican politics was dominated by the Institutional Revolutionary Party, PRI. So the private sector does not like this, and it reacted negatively with a decline in the peso and a 6% decline in the stock market. Basically, the reason why is that there is fears of wide-scale constitutional changes that will consolidate power under a single party, militarize the police or further militarize the police, popular vote for the Supreme Court justices, and electoral authority in the end of independent regulatory bodies. These actions, if they were to come to fruition, would likely drive away foreign capital investment. They definitely don't seem good for economic results in general. So basically, they've built a populist platform that divides the country into those that represent the people versus elites. They have large cash payments to the poor, but at the same time, criminal violence has reached record highs. And we're definitely present in this election as well, considering that 24 candidates for Congress and mayorships were killed, which is the highest rate of violence in a Mexican election, at least in the modern era. I think it's interesting when we contrast this to India, the large cash payments, which seem to be very effective in Mexico, but less effective in India. So they've greatly expanded the role of the military, which in essence serve as the country's police, which kind of reminds me a little bit of Colombia, where the police and the military are distinct, but the military, especially during the period when they were fighting back against the FARC, took more and more of these roles. Similarly, they build major public works. They control, as you might expect, immigration and infrastructure, and military equipment is used to spy on opposition groups, which is obviously very bad. So they've engaged in campaign violations using public platforms to demonize the opposition. So this has been thwarted at times by the Supreme Court, and obviously would probably block other constitutional reforms. So now the agenda is to seek to make them subject to a popular vote. There is the energy policy, which we're seeing already government subsidies of up to $80 billion to prop up Pemex, the state oil company, and they banned the imports of fracking-based oil products and seem to have an overall ban on fracking. So it was kind of interesting policy, I think, because of how much oil could contribute to Mexican revenues, and that their oil policy is really strange.
Yeah, it's freaking horrible. It's up there with Venezuela in terms of like the level of intelligence in it. Yeah, I mean, Mexico is an interesting place. Before AMLO came to power in 2018, they had actually opened up a number of the leases to foreign companies and foreign investment. And at the time, I was working for California Resources, and we actually looked real closely at it. And it seemed really attractive because this was an industry that fundamentally was still in technology of the 1960s. And it had deployed, so none of the horizontal drilling, none of the fracking, none of the latest kind of completion technologies. So Mexico has the potential to produce far more efficiently, far more oil, enrich its country, build up all of its kind of infrastructure and invest in education, all that. But instead, they've chosen this nationalization route, which aligns much more with what the PRI policy was back in the 1990s. And that's just been a disaster. And the fact that I saw the government has to subsidize the oil company $80 billion to keep it in business at a time of pretty decent oil prices, this is a disaster. This is as bad as Venezuela.
Yeah. I don't know if it's quite as bad as Venezuela, which saw a dramatic decrease.
Yeah, I don't think they purged Pemex of its technical professionals or put in political appointees, but that is kind of what they're doing on the regulatory side, apparently, is instead of independent bodies, they are now just all going to be political cronies.
Yeah.
And who knows what? I mean, they're losing money because of graft, I'm sure. I'm sure there's deep corruption within the industry.
It's just, so that I found very surprising. The other thing I wasn't fully aware of because I hadn't paid enough attention to it, but instead of going after the cartels, the party has adopted a policy of hugs, not bullets. Oh, I love your face. Which is direct cash payments to the poor and military construction of infrastructure, which are two important things.
I don't think any of that. I mean, so the goal behind, I think, the hugs and not bullets is to address the root cause of crime, which is fine, poverty. I get that. I get the welfare payments and things, but you can't do that when you have a militarized, vicious criminal organization that's basically a full non-state actor that controls huge swaths of your territory and has corrupted so much of the politicians, particularly in northern Mexico. you have to root out those organizations before you can go back and address the root causes of why like being parts of gangs is like attractive.
I think you have to do both at the same time.
Yeah, that's fine doing both, but you have to eradicate the violent elements, the non-state actors who have control. The state has to have monopoly on violence in order to be a legitimate authority.
But, one of the reasons why they may not be as interested in that is if you're controlling politicians and those politicians the ones you're promoting happen to be in the main party, that only gives the party more power and more incentive to allow the cartels to go ahead and do that. And in fact, there have been studies that looked in by the U.S. law enforcement agencies that have been investigating possible funding of AMLO's campaigns by the cartels, which is also a problem that happened in Colombia. For a while, most of the presidents in Colombia had significant cartel money that went into campaigns of the winning president.
Yeah, they had the cartel money, and then anybody that was opposed to the cartel got assassinated.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, you're having this sort of vicious cycle. And I think where it runs up against, in terms of like U.S. policy and U.S. interest within Mexico, is that this Mexican government doesn't view the drug trade as a Mexican problem. Right. That the drug trade is a U.S. problem, which I think is fair. That we've always talked about the foolishness of the drug war because the demand by U.S. consumers is so high, it's always going to be met by somebody.
Yeah.
But they actually see it as a jobs program. That was the other interesting thing. Weird. This is an AP report, so I'm just dredging this up from some far right place. But yeah, the drug trade creates jobs in these poor northern regions of Mexico. And the fact that Mexicans aren't addicted to fentanyl and these methamphetamines that, again, the raw products, ingredients coming from China, manufactured in Mexico, and then distributed by the cartels within the U.S. But the demand's there, obviously,
in the U.S. I think the bigger problem, though, is the rampant violence increase in homicides. I mean, I can even see them not caring about the drug trade in itself, but the violence that comes from these cartels. I think one of the things that's also harder about going against the cartels is that there's no like centralized cartel power, right? When Colombia was fighting directly against FARC.
I mean, I think there are certain cartels that are more powerful. I mean, it's similar, before FARC, but I don't think it's so much more dispersed than you had the Medellin cartel. You just had different factions during that period in Colombian history.
Yeah, but they weren't successful against, being able to go against the cartels when they were so diversified. But they may have had more success because they were specifically targeting FARC, which controlled so many of these different cartels.
Yeah, maybe part of it is essentially. I just assumed that, and the other interesting thing about the cartels now is that they don't actually make much of their money off of the drug trade itself. It's rather the protection racket.
Yeah.
So they're so integrated and control so much of these. Yeah. So like the mafia, that it's just extortion from local business owners, from politicians within these regions. You have to pay this protection money, and that's the majority of the funds. And again, the militarization of the police, unlike Colombia, is not being used to try to battle these groups.
That's what's so weird to me, because when I was reading that, I was like, oh, that's kind of natural that there's the militarization.
It seems like it's being used to spy on your opposition.
It's just, to me, that's a weird use of it. I was surprised by seeing that trend, but not seeing them go after the cartels, because you would think that is one of the things you would do by the militarization of the police.
Yeah, so that's why I'm seeing, jumping ahead, if Trump is reelected, there's going to be two issues: immigration, which we won't talk about, and then two, this whole Mexico, because this came up a lot. Remember in the Republican debate, was like, we're going to send in troops to go after the cartels. This is going to be a big issue, I think, if Trump's reelected. I think you're going to see action on this.
One of the reasons why we haven't seen action before this, though, is because Mexico has been doing so much of a job in preventing immigrants from crossing into the U.S. and being willing to.
Yeah, we haven't really challenged. And they kind of make the point in some of those articles that Biden, you've had all these anti-democratic issues, and, We even, we'll wag our finger at India. I mean, because one, they're trying to assassinate their opposition groups within Canada and the U.S. But with Mexico, we're like, no, it's fine. If you're following our immigration policy, then we're okay with this. But what you're going to see, and these two are so closely tied together, is if there's a much more aggressive deportation policy with Trump, Mexico is probably going to push back against that. And then the counter push is going to be, we have an issue with your cartels.
But what happens if they don't counter Trump's immigration policy? What if they just go along with it as long as
I think where they're going to receive like 10 million people that they're going to dump in the country, you think Mexico's going to go along with that?
They might.
Well, then, okay, there probably wouldn't be an issue then. If they were just willing to accept 10 million refugees all at once or over a year.
I mean, I don't know how they handle that, but
yeah, they can handle that.
I have a hard time seeing them challenge Trump's policy, knowing what Trump might do if they do challenge it. I only see them challenging it if someone like Trump does put in American troops on the ground inside of Mexico.
I mean, I think it'll be targeted strikes, but it'll be, I don't know how the hell that would work. It's not like they're real going after drug enforcement, but yeah, targeting the cartel leadership.
But there's so many cartels still. I mean, I don't think that works. I don't think there's a good plan for it if you're doing like targeted strikes or...
Yeah, and particularly given, I mean, the other thing that I was surprised by is there's very limited cooperation engagement between U.S. law enforcement and Mexican law enforcement. The AMLO has actually made it a policy of not cooperating with U.S. law enforcement. So we're not going to have the intelligence and cooperation or the local intelligence necessary to have like these targeted operations. But that's what... I mean, I'm reading probably too much into Republican blathering from that debate, but they all made a point of like how tough they could be to go in and do special ops strikes on cartel groups in Mexico.
Which is such a violation of international law because you're violating sovereignty. And to do that without permission from the Mexican government is pretty unprecedented.
Well, I mean, I guess not dissimilar to what we did getting bin Laden in Pakistan, just going in. It'd be similar to that.
But I think Pakistan already had...
They weren't happy about there was a violation of their sovereignty, for sure.
I thought they were like kind of cooperating with the U.S.
They weren't really... I don't think they were super aware of it. Mm. They weren't happy about it. Because they were kind of implicated, because they was living in the richest area in the city that has a lot of their military leadership. So it was pretty sus.
Yeah, but I thought there was more cooperation between the two countries on terrorism. And even though they might not have been informed and unhappy about that,
but it's still a big
agreements.
violation of going in with your special ops and assassinating somebody in your country.
Well, this would be like if you repeatedly did it, not just a one-time thing.
Yeah, we would repeatedly do it, presumably. I mean, you're not going to get, like you said, there's not one central leader that you can. I mean, El Chapo did control a good amount of that trade back in the day. But yeah, I think it is kind of broken apart more.
Yeah. Well, obviously, Mexico always features heavily into American politics as well. But this has larger consequences internationally in terms of economics. And then it will be really interesting to see if there is how this will be handled by future administrations.
Yeah, and I think, in contrast to the India story, it does represent a backsliding of democracy. I mean, they are doing what BJP wanted to do. They're going to have the supermajorities. They're going to be able to make fundamental constitutional changes in this relatively young democracy, because they've only had multi-party competition since the 90s, is going to backslide probably into one-party rule.
Yeah, and so that's really disturbing to have on your border and kind of just disturbing in the trend of democracy writ large.
Yeah, and I don't get the part that I don't connect real well is the one benefit that's been to the Mexican economy is obviously our challenge with China and trying to decouple with China. A lot of that manufacturing has come back to Mexico. How does this whole thing factor into the attractiveness of Mexico as like a destination? I mean, part of it is just the geography is always going to be great and it's always going to be a cheap labor source. So maybe it doesn't affect anything. maybe the cost of business, and I assume U.S. manufacturers don't have to deal with cartel
or even
controlled
if they
areas.
do,
I don't know.
Even if they do, I mean, they're buying off, right? So
yeah, technically under the Anti-Corruption Act, they can't buy off foreign entities or pay protection money.
I don't know. I mean, being able to get your products labeled as Mexican, even if most of it comes from China, is a pretty powerful motivator.
Yeah.
Let's also talk, there's still, though, a lot of tension between this idea of friendshoring and reshoring that I'll talk about when we get to the batteries.
Yeah.
So the other topic we wanted to get to is more of a in focus sort of topic about the battery wars that are central to electric vehicles. And just in the context of this, some background, the US has a goal of 50% of cars being sold by 2030 to be electric. And, a lot of articles have pointed out that at the same time, policies to reduce dependence on China threaten this goal. And I found it interesting that, like in the IRA tax credits, only 11 car models meet the demands. So it's pretty narrow what cars actually can meet the demand of not having foreign parts by countries like China. Critical minerals can't be more than 50% from China.
Now, did they reform this in terms of like why? Because I was surprised by that too, like how few models qualified. Does that now include like kind of the friendshoring components? So the components come from the EU or Japan or Canada or Mexico, that counts towards that? Or is this like US sourced?
I think this is US sourced, except for critical minerals, which can come from friendly countries.
Okay, so it's still that restrictive. It doesn't incorporate that friendshoring aspect. So that's why only 11 models qualified.
So the reason why batteries are so important is 40% of the cost is the electric battery in them. And this has given China a huge advantage because they produce batteries that are lower cost and more technologically advanced, which makes their cars more affordable and even possibly of better quality than the ones produced in the West. So there was a foreign affairs article that went into the idea that the US could build its own supply chain as long as it was willing to invest hundreds of billions of dollars in it, which is one thing that they kind of glossed over. But the obstacle for the US in building lower cost batteries are the fact that China controls critical minerals and supply chains. So basically, China produces over 70% of the world's lithium-ion batteries, holding a similar share in refining, processing, and manufacturing stages. Furthermore, they control crucial minerals such as cobalt and graphite, further strengthening their position. So how would the US build its own supply chains? One thing that the Foreign Affairs article points out is that the IRA has been a boon, especially to the supply chain for electric vehicles. US battery production is expected to jump from 257 gigawatt hours in 2023 to over 1,000 gigawatt hours by 2030, which is enough batteries for the 10 million vehicles per year roughly produced in the US annually. The problem with this is that, okay, so that's what's being produced now, but we want to produce more vehicles in the future, and that doesn't meet our goals if we were able to meet the increases needed to meet 2030 goals. Really key is focusing on critical minerals. Basically, 3 of them that get mentioned the most are graphite, nickel, and lithium. China mines 68% of these, and it processes most of them. This is really crucial, and I think something the Foreign Affairs really left out article is that it's not just about mining and finding deposits of them, but even more important is having the process plants, right? And so that's something that's severely lacking in the US and was glossed over in the article. So they estimate it would cost hundreds of $billions to do this. Another article talked about $82 billion, but obviously the expense would be very high. It mentions that even in the mining process, we don't have enough mineral reserves in the United States and Canada to meet the demand for 5 out of the 8 key battery minerals over the rest of the decade, but we could get there if we added the UK and Australia. But at the same time, that's just for projections for the decade. What do we do after that? But it's also a matter of time. They're kind of at the same time, they're assuming that we could put this together in the next decade. They mentioned that it takes an average of 15.7 years to open a new mine. And they don't even talk about what would be involved in processing plants, which also have heavy pollution associated with them. They mentioned that private investment is not enough, which I think is kind of obvious. And one of the reasons why China was able to develop this technology and keep producing these electric batteries is because of the substantial support from the Chinese government. And so the U.S. would have to needs to decide, how important is this? And I think because we have so many tariffs and other measures to prevent car manufacturing companies from buying Chinese batteries, and in general against EV cars, that the U.S. needs to counterbalance that by putting a substantial amount of money. But I think some of the articles point out we can't, even if we adopted all these measures, we can't get to the 2030 goals with the kind of tariffs and stuff that we have on batteries in the cars right now. As I just said, when you think about just opening another mine, it would take almost 16 years to do that. I don't think that can be sped up substantially. Say you change regulations, you might speed that up to 10 years or something like that. But that's definitely not enough for the decade. And mostly what you've seen is reopening of mines, and maybe you can do that a little bit faster. But this implies you would need a lot of new mines to be able to get enough materials.
I mean, you can fast track permitting and put more resource, because a lot of it is just the environmental assessment reviews and all the upfront regulatory, community engagement, all the things that China doesn't have to care about because they give a crap less about the communities that it exploits. Right, exactly. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, you could conceivably shorten that probably to 5 years.
I mean, the problem is, one thing I've learned about renewable energy sources is it takes 10 years from a plan to build a wind farm to actually building it because of the whole review process of environmental regulations. Yep. And so I don't see there to be a lot of hope that you're going to dramatically reduce the timeframes of that. Well,
it's, I mean, part of it is just the resources you put for the survey work and the environmental assessment. I mean, that can be sped up through throwing more people at it. I think the part that makes it difficult is the time for community engagement, comment period,
which is at least
consensus
about 2 years in
building,
itself.
All of those things. That's much harder to speed up. The analysis part, you can speed up. You throw enough people at it, but the consensus building and getting communities on board, much more difficult.
Yeah, so there's definitely this problem of saying we need more critical minerals within the next decade. Here, if we mine more, we could get that. But then saying, well, we can't open a mine in the next decade.
Yeah, no, I find the whole thing, I mean, I have multiple issues. One, and maybe this goes back to the whole solar panel discussion, kind of what gets determined as a strategic concern, in terms of what we're targeting China and trying to prevent imports in. Batteries and kind of the battery inputs and definitely the minerals going into battery. I mean, these are raw inputs. Should we really be so concerned on the criticality of these? Or should we loosen up, around the idea of because all of these goals, I think one of the articles made this clear, is that all these goals of, wanting to build up U.S. manufacturing, on wanting to meet, net zero goals and wanting to increase national security, they're all in competition with each other. So something has to give at a certain point. You can't pursue all three. So why focus this much on a low margin, environmentally destructive process that we're trying to either locate here in the United States, which, we've talked about all the challenges of trying to do in a responsible way, because we're not going to do it irresponsibly, because that goes against, other environmental sustainability goals. Or do you accept that, yeah, fine, you can stay this manufacturer of low margin raw inputs. We're going to protect against the high end stuff like the electric vehicle manufacturing.
Yeah, see, as you're talking, like that seems like a compromise because the problem is, the US car makers are losing money off their electric vehicles. And one of the articles gives this example, actually it was a video by Vox, gives this example of like the Ford, one of the Ford trucks, which its electric version cost, at least $5,000 more than its traditional combustion engine version of it. And they just can't make money if these cars are priced higher than their oil combustion cars. So, and that's a huge problem. And what the key factor in that, as I said, the battery is 40% of the cost.
Yeah.
And so all these measures we've targeted at preventing the import of batteries, preventing car battery factories set up in the United States that use this Chinese technology. So the factory would be in the US, but because of the ties to China, it's considered a national security threat.
Yeah.
So we're not even doing that. And if we can't lower the costs, our cars themselves can't be competitive.
Right. Yeah. Not the global non-protect. I mean, it looks like EU is going to put up barriers to the Chinese vehicles as well. But yeah, not in the rest of the world market.
Yeah. And that's a problem. If you can't have these massive economies of scale, then it makes, again, it harder for the US car makers to make profits and to be able to continue making these cars and make advances in these cars. And it seems this is what I think so much of it is. Instead of tariffs, instead of the IRA even being so restrictive, that we should still put our money into building up our supply chains and supporting this industry, but at the same time, reduce some of the tariffs and the ability to import these batteries so that we still have something for the interim as we build up our own competitiveness.
Yeah, I just don't see how we get to that competitive. The other interesting thing that I read was that there's a massive oversupply of capacity for battery. I mean, China has, was it like 4 or 5 times the global demand for batteries in terms of the production capacity? That's a money losing. I mean, how are you going to get any private sector investment? Yeah. Well, I mean, that's what the IRA is to introduce that. But for such a low margin, I don't get the full national strategic competition, this national security aspect of it. And then I would push back and say, well, maybe the one thing that needs to be given, we have a competitive advantage in natural gas. Why push so hard on these 2030 goals when you could achieve, particularly with carbon sequestration, you could still achieve, 90% of your goals? And then look at it from a global perspective. The real battles are about coal plants coming online in China and India. And the biggest thing that we could do is to increase natural gas production and get them off of that, as opposed to trying to completely work against the natural economies, the competitive advantages, and bring a low margin, heavily polluted, non-national security related base like battery manufacturing or solar panel manufacturing to the US. It just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I get chip manufacturing because those are good jobs and that's very high-end tech. I don't get the solar panel or the battery manufacturing.
Well, I don't get solar panels. The problem, the national security issue is the critical minerals. We feel it's like that's part of the supply chain that China could, stop sending us critical minerals.
I guess around chips, yeah. I get that part. I don't get it around like batteries or solar panels.
Or even the dependence on the batteries could hurt our car industries if our car industry started relying on Chinese batteries.
Well, and I'm saying maybe you slow that roll on the transition to electric vehicles then. You have more hybrids. I think a hybrid's a natural compromise where you still have the flexibility in case of wartime restrictions that you can pump in that plentiful supply of gasoline or natural gas.
Okay, 2 things. One, if you're getting to 2030 goals, you can't just do it by this natural gas.
And I'm saying the 2030 goals are probably unrealistic and that the bigger global impact is around global south increases in carbon production because of coal plants coming online.
Well, I'm sorry, but you have to do something to counter that in developed countries.
Yeah, but it's not nearly enough to counter that. These little marginal productions that we're going to throw billions of dollars at something that's not economic or environmentally sustainable in other ways. If these mines are unpleasant operations and it just doesn't make sense for developed economies to do these sort of productive processes.
But then you're always vulnerable to China and threatening the cutoff of any critical mineral.
Well, I think it has to be a better balance. It doesn't feel like this is the right balance.
I mean, from your perspective, all these tariffs and everything preventing these cars and batteries coming to the U.S. doesn't matter because you think electric vehicles don't matter.
No, I think the adoption. Well, no, what I'm saying is that you lessen tariffs on that and you use Chinese-made batteries.
Well, then you could
to build your industry,
meet the goals because then it's more cost effective.
Yeah, no. I think you do, but it's again that contradict. But then maybe you're compromising now on national security. Is what you're saying because it was we're dependent on Chinese batteries that they're going to cut those off in a wartime situation. I mean, I think it makes more case for hybrids vehicles as there's your compromise for ensuring that Americans can still drive if they're batteries, batteries last like 5 years. I think we talked about this before, that wasn't good. It was the same with solar panels. It wasn't like it immediately cripple everything. Yeah. Also, military vehicles are not going to be running on, most of them are not going to be running on batteries.
Definitely not Chinese-made batteries.
No. That's still going to be running on diesel. I say mostly diesel and jet fuel.
Well, I mean, so I have two minds about this.
And nuclear for the naval vessels. But
I think you allow these lower cost batteries and you make American-made cars, more affordable. Mm-hmm. And I think it would be huge in adoption and in car companies actually making money off electric vehicles.
Yeah. Yep.
At the same time, you can work on innovation of battery technology, right? And put money behind that.
You should. Yep. I'm 100% on that. I think we need to leapfrog this lithium ion thing. I was reading about some of the alternatives and read through it in detail. I know the sodium one, had some big drawbacks, but that's where we have a competitive advantage or should have a competitive advantage. And that's where we should put our resources is on the next generation battery technology, ones that more fit with our strengths in terms of the supply base.
Yeah, but I don't know that we can just abandon the critical minerals in general and say that we're just content to rely on China for processing all these minerals.
Well, not around the chips. Anything around things powering AI, those critical minerals, that still needs to be a focus. I get that. But around solar panels, around batteries, let's try to leapfrog that on both, frankly, both solar panel technology and batteries. And continue to depend on China to some extent, seeing where we can encourage other manufacturers within Southeast Asia or India to help kind of friendshore it. But
that also is somewhere where we could make some advances. So there's also battery makers in Japan. South Korea still controls 39% of the market. The EU is promoting more domestic production. The UK is promoting more domestic production. Other comparative advantages that we could go for. So the United Kingdom has a competitive R&D landscape. Southeast Asia is expected to be an important hub for electric two-wheeled vehicles, in addition to its ability to have critical minerals processing and refining capabilities. Yep. So more friendshoring could also help solve some of these problems.
I think that's definitely the way to go. I mean, where those competitive advantages work out with those friends.
Yeah. I still think, though, unfortunately, these tariffs and stuff are popular policy because anything anti-China is popular policy. And I think they'll make electric vehicle adoption very difficult in the U.S.
Yeah, if we have to wait until there's a full supply chain from the mine to the car on all the minerals that go into it, then it's going to be a long time.
It'll be decades.
And an extraordinary waste of money.
Yeah. So that's the battery wars. As you mentioned, it's not just in the U.S., but there's a lot of concern in Europe that these cars undermine European car makers because, as I mentioned, they are much lower cost than Western car makers are producing electric vehicles, and they're of really good quality. Like, it would be different if they were just cheap cars.
Yeah, just garbage. But yeah, it's extraordinary. Yeah, I mean, these are like, they're higher end, pretty capable cars are like $10,000.
Mm-hmm. Which, of course, threatens the market. I mean,
that would destroy if you just let them in, it would destroy the U.S. and European car markets.
Yeah.
It would wipe them out.
Yeah.
So maybe the high end consumer wouldn't wipe out. But yeah, for the average consumer who's like feeling the pinch right now from increased car prices, I mean, yeah.
So batteries are a place where you're still dependent on China, but at least you can make your own cars more affordable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, that's one way to think about it too.
Yeah, it's just it's a low margin component that gets plugged into a greater system. It doesn't make sense that we would make it here.
A little unfair to the consumer. I would love to have a $10,000 good electric car.
Yeah. I mean, I had to resist I think I told you this before, but even around robot vacs, I can't remember if we mentioned this last time, but I unfortunately invested in iRobot. Don't look at the stock price now, but back in the day, they were seen as, Boston-based, cutting edge. They had the best like home consumer robotics. They're investing in like other types of robots, like clean your gutters, clean your pools, all this sort of stuff. And they had a real competitive advantage and lead. But they lost it all because they stuck with this certain technology. The Chinese companies had moved on to LiDAR, which is another way of kind of detecting obstacles and things. And because they can manufacture so much cheaper, you can get these much more capable, smarter vacuum robots now that now dominate the market. And now iRobot, which was going to be bought by Amazon, that deal's fallen through, is now like on the verge of bankruptcy.
I don't understand why you decided not to buy it because it was Chinese made.
Because it's sad, because that to me represents a high-end enough product. I mean, I guess because it's a smart robot that vacuums itself, that's something the U.S. should be able to compete on and did, but then blew it.
I think we should buy a Chinese version.
No. I only buy cheap cruddy stuff.
I don't understand why
that it doesn't make sense for U.S. to manufacture. But for robots, yeah, I assume that U.S. can compete on robotics. That's a future big market, and the U.S. should be able to compete on that. Just like the high-end chips, but not on crappy components like solar panels and batteries.
You're not doing anything to help the U.S. compete.
What?
You not buying the Chinese.
Yeah, that
does not help the U.S. compete.
Well, I mean, it helps not reward the Chinese manufacturer. Anyway, why aren't they targeting these Chinese vacuum robots for high tariffs too? That's what I understand.
I don't even understand your logic. It reminded me, though, of this article that's caused much consternation from The Economist this week, which was just about China being a science powerhouse.
Yeah.
And it also reminded me of a conversation with your dad over Mother's Day. This idea that many people still have is China being technologically backward and kind of just re-engineering Western items and such and producing lower quality, whereas China has invested so much in science and technology that they have very advanced scientific technology of their own, and that's just the technological advantages are undercutting many of these products.
Yeah, and I think that feeds into my, you're making fun of my robot vacuum story. I think part of that may be in the outcome of the innovation.
Strategic? Are vacuum robots strategic?
I don't know. Are batteries strategic? I don't feel like.
Yeah, we already just said batteries are not.
Oh, okay. Yeah, but they're targeting all Chinese. I mean, let's be honest. Trump comes back. It's 100% tariff on all Chinese products coming in.
Well, a good time to buy one now then.
Yeah, maybe. But no, I think it is. Yeah, because to your point, I didn't read the full article, but I did see the study, I think, coming from Nature that looked at the citations, which really triggered this. Because if you have a lot of different ones, and how do you measure like scientific output? And then more importantly, how do you measure the quality of that scientific output? I think Nature put out one around citations to very highly prestigious scientific journals. And for the first time, Chinese-based or located scientists and engineers are now surpassed the United States in terms of these citations. And this is seen as kind of a watershed event of their outputs. And yeah, they've invested a lot. I'd personally like to know how much is being driven because, we've talked about before, and I've definitely studied in detail. Have trained a number, many thousands, tens of thousands of their PhD. A small number, 10%, returned to China. I know they've been critical at like Tsinghua and some of their top-end universities. How much of this is being driven by Western-trained PhDs?
Yeah.
Even though the vast majority, the gain, the benefit, the vast majority is to us because 90% of them stay. 10% of them do go back. Is it that 10% that's made a difference? And now that they brought back that culture, which depends certainly on openness, I think that's a long-term threat to them continuing this trend. But is this a product of, bringing back that cutting-edge Western research from Western-trained PhDs? Is that making this difference now in China?
Well, I think the question also is that, China's putting all this support. It's put a lot of money into developing technology and scientific explorations. And when you talk about robotics, it's about, can we innovate? And that requires more money probably from the public sector.
Yeah, it requires that. I think the other, the other thing I've always argued is the unique ecosystem that exists between our universities and then that first stage of private capital in terms of what Silicon Valley is, this hub between like Stanford, Berkeley, and the companies there in terms of empowering these innovative startups. Is China recreating that same...
Absolutely.
Can you recreate that same system with the restrictions that the Xi regime has put on universities and on capital? Is that sustainable or not?
Right. But absolutely, China has these innovation hubs that very much center around universities.
Yeah, I know, but but those were products of like Hu Jintao and before him Jiang Zemin. But how much is that? Are we just seeing it because it's a lag effect? You set up these systems, you set up this relative openness, you give capital kind of the freedom to invest in these things. But that's changed over the last 5 years with this kind of increased restriction and party control. Are we just seeing like a lagging effect of the positive input when China was more market liberalization and we're going to worry about something that's already, they've kind of destroyed the goose that lays the golden egg?
I mean, that may very well be possible. But I think the problem you alluded to is not so solvable in the US in the sense that there's not nearly enough private venture capital to really take a lot of these technological developments into commercial products. That stage is very underdeveloped. And one thing that, it's interesting, the government funds projects like in DARPA that creates all this cool technology, but then doesn't put the funds into making a commercial product from that.
Yeah, that's always been, private capital is great at scaling once the commercialization and profitability has been proven, but you need the government translation funds. Government's good at funding that basic research, but then it needs to also get it to scale to the point where private capital can take over because it's profit. I know government has to do all the work, but government should also be getting profit sharing for all of this that it's doing too. That was part of the problem, I think, with the COVID vaccine, is that all the research and the work was done by government scientists on the fundamental basic science, but then all of the profit was captured by private firms.
Yeah, I mean, that's a problem. I don't know how profit sharing would really work in trying to not intervene as much in the economy, but we need to do what the economy itself can't do. And what is not in the incentive for businesses to do is to create a commercial product.
Yeah, and this, I mean, essentially it's the role of venture capital is supposed to be the role.
But that's not where venture capital money goes mostly.
Well, they do lose. I mean, they do invest in a lot of ideas that go nowhere. But I think because it's key with like energy and these bigger things, it's not like investing in a dumb app that costs like, you're hardly throwing any money, and they'll invest in 100 of them and one will succeed and they'll make billions and billions from that. Energy requires, as an example, like a big investment that you're right, VCs doesn't want to get because that's too risky.
Yeah. So I think we identify, I study this in my class on industrial mobilization and competition, what the incentives are for private industry and how if the government does not take up that mantle, we're not able to fully take advantage of our own technological innovations.
Exactly. And that's actually this, going back to the article that I wrote, the Pittsburgh Gazette, that's another point that we make. Project 2025 wants to get rid of the already kind of underfunded translation funding that like the DOE provides, because they don't want to quote unquote pick winners and losers within the market, because they are under the assumption that private capital alone can do it all.
And this fundamental misunderstanding of what the incentives are for private capital and how those incentives have changed through changes to stock market and type of reporting, what they want to see from companies. And there's a lot of incentives that have changed over the last couple of decades that have also drained some of this money from these transition phases.
Yeah, it's probably, maybe some of the sources for funding for venture capital have now shifted to such that I don't think they were ever set up to take on high risk sort of ideas that are these kind of fundamental non-software related sort of things. But I think they've become more risk adverse.
Yeah. So a lot of things for the government to actually invest in, and we have no solutions of where the money is going to come from. Sounds about right.
Yeah.
About how I was teaching the energy industrial studies analysis, and on their final project, to bring in like business leaders and government leaders to kind of hear their project. And the more libertarian, business-minded person who is the CEO of his company was like, every single solution you suggested costs a lot of money, right? And we only have so much money. So that seems to be a huge problem. So that is our show, I think.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. Well, this brings us to the end of this episode of Kellogg's Global Politics. You can visit our website at www.kelloggsglobalpolitics.com and follow us on Twitter now/X, Global Kellogg, or me, AR Kellogg.
And you can reach us by email. So Anita at kelloggsglobalpolitics.com and myself, Ryan, at kelloggsglobalpolitics.com. As always, please see the show notes for the articles we discussed in this episode. And if you like the show, please take the time, tell your friends, share it on your social sites. It's a simple, quick, and free way to support the show. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye.